Justice and righteousness. Justice and righteousness. Rocky guys kicked off talking about these last week. So righteousness, the Hebrew word, tzedakah, that means it's the standard of right relationship between all people. Justice, the Hebrew word here is mishpat. And that is the actions you do to create the standard of rightness. So that's what we're talking about. If you're taking notes, you might want to write down these definitions. We'll be working from these all month as we continue talking about this new series, Just Right. And this is really important because it's really important to God. It's something that's near to his heart. Psalms 11:7 says it like just pretty straightforward. The righteous Lord, loves justice. Just right. Those are two words. The righteous Lord loves justice. The virtuous will see his face. So that's why we're going to spend a whole month talking about just right. It is near to God's heart. Here's the interesting part, is that most of us, if I were to sit down and talk with you, you would probably agree that there's a lot of injustice in the world, right? I mean, I don't know if anyone would raise your hand and say, no, I disagree with that. I doubt you would. There's a lot of injustice in our world. And if God loves justice and righteousness, it's worth asking, how did we get here? We're going to talk about that tonight. And another interesting thing is, have you ever tried to read through the Bible in a year? Or maybe you've tried to read through the Bible plan and you've gotten to the prophetic literature? If you spent any time in that, you've probably been thoroughly confused and kind of confused about, how is God, why does God get so angry? You read the prophetic literature and you're like, I thought God was love, but he's talking about judgment and justice and wrath, and it's intense stuff when you get into the prophetic literature. One example here, prophetic literature, that's the writings of the prophets. So Isaiah, if you go to Isaiah chapter 1, should have it up on the screen here. Isaiah 1, starting in verse 24. Here we go. Therefore, the Lord of heaven's armies, the mighty one of Israel says, I will take revenge on my enemies. I will pay back my foes. I will raise my fist against you. I will melt you down and skim off your sludge. I will remove all your impurities. That's kind of shocking, right? Maybe you haven't read something like that before. To read that from our loving God. This is what he's saying, and here's the more startling part. He's saying this to Israel. Those are his chosen people. Why does God get so angry? The key is in the verse before it, Isaiah 1:23. It says, your leaders are rebels, companions of thieves. All of them love bribes and demand payoffs. They refuse to be defended. They refuse to defend the cause of the orphans or fight for the rights of widows. Why does God get so angry? Injustice. If you wonder what injustice is, this verse gives you a pretty good picture right there of Israel's injustice. When you read through the Old Testament, you see that God gets pretty angry about that. So, 2 questions for tonight that we're going to look at is, why does God care so much about justice? And what does injustice look like in the world today? Why does God care so much about justice? What does injustice look like in the world today? I hope to answer both of those for you tonight. All right, so to answer those questions, we need to start all the way back on page 1 of the Bible. Start back page 1 of the Bible, because in the beginning, God created the world. And when he created the world, this is the world. It was just right. Everything was good. Things were going great. And then God created the pinnacle of his creation. The real highlight here, I just carry these around all the time. No need to be concerned. No need to be concerned here. Hang tight. I got another one in here. There we go. All right. So he created the pinnacle of his creation. Humanity. I know the height is a little off. It's fine. It's fine. It's all good. We don't know how tall Adam and Eve were. They may look just like this. Okay. So, God creates humanity. And he sets humanity apart from all of his creation. Humanity, there's something different. When he created Adam and Eve, it was different than everything else. They were set apart from all the animals, set apart from all the other beautiful creation he made. Humans were the highlight. And when God created humans, everything was just right. Things were good. Humans lived in equality. They were both on the same level. There was justice, righteousness in the world, and that's how it was supposed to be. This is how it's supposed to always be. That humans living in equality, everything was just right, living in relationship with God. But some of us know the story doesn't end there, because humans decide, in just this brazen act of defiance against God, they decide, I don't care what you said, God. It doesn't matter. I think I know what's better for me than what God knows. So I'm going to go and do what I want. And humans rebel against God. And they decide to just go and do their own thing. They don't care about what the creator of the world told them. They don't care about what he said was right. They decide, I'm going to do what I think is right instead. Just like a lot of us often do. And when they do this, brokenness enters the world. See, things start to change. No longer is everything just right. But now there's broken relationship. No longer does it just seem like equality and everything is good and everyone is on an even playing field. Now there's brokenness in the world. God even says this in Genesis 3. He tells Adam and Eve, the consequences of your sin is brokenness is entering the world. There's going to be conflict between men and women now. And there's now going to be brokenness. And if we're looking at history, it's much more like, let's say, probably much more like this is what we see in history, tragically. Is more a situation a lot more like this. Inequality is what we see. That's unjust. So the story continues. We see this all over the world, right? Injustice, brokenness in relationships, inequality now. Our world is full of it. We see some people rich, and they're living off of just total luxury, extravagance, more than any person possibly needs, where you have other people who are dying in the streets of starvation. We see one gender that maybe raises up and oppresses against another gender just because of differences. We see racial inequality, where one race decides that I think I'm better than you just because of some stupid pigment in their skin, that they think that makes me better than you. And we see inequality. And our world is just full of it now. We'll continue with the story, with the biblical story, because it doesn't end there. So we fast forward a few thousand years, and the Israelites, these are my Israelites, the Israelites are living in Egypt. The Israelites live in Egypt, and they are in slavery. Oh my, I don't know if he's going to stay. All right, so the Israelites are living in Egypt. They're living in Egypt in slavery. And here they are, the small minority group that is Israel is being oppressed by the majority superpower of the world, Egypt. Common story that we've seen in the world. And there we go. This is unjust. So this angers God. And God decides that he is going to bring justice. These are his people. He hates them being oppressed. And he's going to bring justice into the world. So what does God do? He calls this man Moses. Moses comes out, and through this series of plagues, God brings the Egyptians down and brings justice to the Israelites. And then we move on to our next part of the story. So maybe a year or so later, the Israelites, they're out in the wilderness now. Now the Israelites, they are wandering in the wilderness, and God sets some laws with the Israelites. God makes a covenant with them. But this covenant that God sets comes with some rules. The covenant is going to come with some rules. See, exactly, there's like about 613 laws in the Old Testament that God gives to the Israelites. And God had promised to make the Israelites into a great nation. He's going to make them into a great nation, but there were some laws he was going to have them follow. Specifically, in Deuteronomy 10:17, in Deuteronomy 10:17, God is very clear with the Israelites that he does not want them to do what Israel did, what the Egyptians did to them. He lays it out that he does not want them to do the same thing. He doesn't want them to ever oppress someone. If I can get that, Deuteronomy 10:17. So this is what Moses is telling, he's relaying to the Israelites what God has told them. This is what he says. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords. He is the great God, the mighty and awesome God who shows no partiality and cannot be bribed. He ensures that the orphans and widows receive justice. He shows love to the foreigners living among you and gives them food and clothing. So, you too must show love to the foreigners, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. So what's God saying? Remember the Egyptians? Remember how they oppressed you when you were foreigners living in Egypt? Remember how they took you as slaves? God is saying, never do that to another group of people. Never do that to anyone else. God is saying, Israel, you're my chosen people. And God's not just choosing Israel because he's just playing favorites. No, Israel has a very special role. Israel has a role in the world that their job is to show the rest of the world what God looks like. That's Israel's role. They're going to show everyone else, this is what our God is like. So God's very clear. You yourselves were once foreigners, so do not do that to someone else. But unfortunately, as history often shows, and the historian once quoted, power tends to corrupt. And unfortunately, that is what we see with Israel. The once enslaved minority group of Israel begins to grow to power. You see, the monarchy, Israel kind of goes through an interesting phase where they're ruled by judges and things are kind of crazy. And then Israel rises to power under King David. You may have heard of David before. We talked about him a little bit in here. And Israel rises up to power. And at the peak of their power, King David, things are going great. Then King David's son, Solomon, you may have heard of this guy before. Solomon becomes king. And Solomon starts off okay. And he has some good moments. Israel's kind of at the top of their game. Israel, they're now the superpower. They're now the nation. They've got a huge military force. And then things take an awful turn. Solomon makes some significant moral failures in his life, and things take this turn. 1 Kings 9:20 says this. And this is during Solomon's reign. There were still people living in the land who were not Israelites, including the Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. I butchered those. These were the descendants of the many nations who the people of Israel had not completely destroyed. So Solomon conscripted them as slaves, and they were forced to serve as slave laborers to this day. So once Israel gets to power, what do? They do exactly what Egypt did to them. And now King Solomon is starting to sound a lot more like Pharaoh than he is the righteous king who's supposed to show what God looks like to the world. He's starting to look just like Pharaoh did. Injustice. It's all over the world. And eventually the kingdom of Israel divides into two kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdom, kingdom of Israel, kingdom of Judah, and one after another bad king reigns, and they continue to perpetuate this injustice. So we pick up a book like Isaiah and we read that verse like we read in the beginning, and we wonder, why is God so harsh? Like, he's getting really intense with the Israelites. This is why God was so intense with the Israelites. They had a role. They were supposed to show the world, this is what your God is like. But what did they do instead? They became just like the Egyptians were. Injustice. So we move to Isaiah chapter 58. Isaiah 58. I'm not going to have this one up on the screen. I'll give you a chance to turn to it if you want to. This one's a little bit longer. The Israelites continued to oppress the vulnerable of society. They would oppress the most vulnerable people in the world. And actually, I get you to skip back for a second. I got a slide on wickedness here. I want to just give you this definition for just a second. And it's by this biblical scholar. Rocky introduced this one to us last week. And it says that the wicked are those who are willing to disadvantage the community to advantage themselves. What does that mean? The wicked are people who, slavery is a perfect example of this. It's people who are willing to say, I care more about me than I do you. So I'm going to disadvantage you. I'm going to make your life more difficult to make my life better. Because as this guy's working as a slave, each time it's building them up. It's adding more bricks to their tower, and they're getting better. That's the biblical definition. That's what wickedness is. So we carry forward. Let's go back to that Isaiah passage. Thank you. So here was the worst part about Israel's wickedness, is that they would walk around and act like we're so religious. We're so much better than any of you. Look at us. Look how pious we are. We fast. We serve God. We're God's nation. And meanwhile, injustice prevails. So Isaiah 58 has a pretty rough accusation against Israel. I'm going to read through verse 8 here. Let me get a drink of water before I do that. Isaiah 58, starting in verse 1. Shout with the voice of a trumpet blast. Shout aloud. Don't be timid. Tell my people Israel of their sins. These are God's words coming through Isaiah. Yet they are so pious. They come to the temple every day. They seem delighted to learn about me. They act like a righteous nation that would never abandon the laws of their God. They ask me, take action on their behalf, pretending they want to be near me. We fasted for you, they say. Why aren't you impressed? We've been very hard on ourselves, and you don't even notice. I will tell you why, I respond. It is because you are fasting to please yourselves. Even while you fast, you keep oppressing your workers. What good is a fast when you keep on fighting and quarreling? This kind of fast will never get you anywhere with me. You humble yourselves by going through the motions of penance, bowing your head like reeds bending in the wind. You dress in burlap and you cover yourself with ashes. Is this what you call fasting? Do you really think that this will please your Lord? No. This is the kind of fasting I want. Free those who are wrongly imprisoned. Lighten the burden of those who work for you. Let the oppressed go free. Remove the chains that bind people. Share your food with the hungry and give shelter to the homeless. Give clothes to those who need them and do not hide from relatives who need your help. Then your salvation will come like the dawn, and your wounds will quickly heal. Your godliness will lead you forward, and the glory of the Lord will protect you from behind. So what's God saying? I don't care about your religious displays. What I want is I want you to seek justice, to act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with your God. This has always been God's heart. This is always what he wants. And I know this can get confusing when we read the Old Testament. I get it. It is for me too. We read some weird laws, this, that, and the other. But God doesn't care about all that. This is what he's always wanted. This is what he's been after. To act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. That's what he's telling the Israelites. I don't care about your displays of religion when you're treating people like this. Maybe he'd say the same thing to us sometimes, if we're honest with ourselves. We come in on Sunday and we raise our hands in worship, but we just treated our parents or siblings in a way that Jesus probably wouldn't. I don't know, maybe. From the very beginning, God created a world that was filled with justice and righteousness, but we messed it up. We messed it up, and the Israelites are not the only ones that spread injustice, that continue to perpetrate that. We do it too, all the time in our worlds. That we spread this injustice. But what does injustice look like in our world today? Hopefully, I've answered the question for you: why does God care about justice? I think it's pretty clear. That's how he created us. God gave us a special image, that we're the image of God, and he does not want a person to be mistreated like this. But what does injustice look like in our world today? So, based on some stuff that I've been reading and just going through scripture, this is the definition of injustice that I came up with, is that injustice is any act that advantages oneself at the disadvantage of someone else. And it's just like that definition of wickedness. It's something that advantages me, that makes my life better at the disadvantage of you. This is something that maybe sometimes we call this self-preservation. Sounds a little bit nicer than injustice, but a lot of times it's the same thing. And I think this happens a lot in our worlds, that we spread this injustice. And when we hear this, it's easy to kind of think of just the big things, right? Like a lot of times I hear injustice, my mind goes to just like these large areas. You pop on the news, you're going to hear some stories of injustice. You're going to hear about racial injustice, where there's these systems of racism in the world that hold down one race just because of the color of your skin. Or you hear about men that exploit young girls that sell their dignity for a quick $1. Or you hear about stories of child labor, of maybe even some of the clothes or electronics that we have that were used by workers that were kind of exploited. And it's easy to hear those things, and that's kind of where we think of when we think injustice. But I also think that this can kind of hit home for us, because I think that a lot of us do this too, maybe just in a less obvious way. And one of the ways I came up with, I had a conversation with some high schoolers this week, and things that kind of, when we were talking about what this looks like in your schools, in the world, is kind of came to was labels. What do I mean by that? Is, I think a lot of times we can put a label on a person to sort of just write them off as kind of being less than us. What does a label do? A label is something that it identifies something. And it's one thing, maybe if you put a label on your stuff that you take to school so that you know it's yours and you identify this, that oh, this belongs to me. That's one thing, that's fine. But then sometimes we put labels on to people. And it's not quite like saying that they belong to you, although that does happen in the world, but it's it's a way that I think we devalue people. Labels devalue people. Because what it does is it says that I'm just going to write you off as a person because you're just a woman. That's all. I'm just going to write you off, and that's it. Or it says, I'm going to write you off because you are a different race than me, and because you look different than me, I'm just going to put you in this box. Or it says that I'm going to just kind of, because you kind of act this way, you're a little differently, or this guy's kind of an idiot. And because he's kind of an idiot, I really don't care about him that much. And it's a way that we tend to write people off. Like maybe with a phrase like, it's that's that guy that did that thing. You remember this is the girl that did that, and we end up putting someone's value as to just this one thing that they did. Labeling people is the act of reducing a person's value to one fact about him or her. What I'm not saying, I'm not talking about just saying, oh, that guy's tall, or saying like a positive thing about them. That's something different. I'm talking about sometimes we tend to write someone off because he's just the homeschool kid. So I don't really care to get to know him. I really don't care to kind of walk into this person's story, because they're just this. And we put someone in a box, in a category, to where we don't really care about who they are as a person. This is what the B word is all about. Just got everyone's attention there. And the N word. There's a lot of people who listen to some rap that have a lot of those words going on in it. Well, what are those words about? What do they mean? What does that mean if you use the B word? I think what it means is that we're saying that you're not a human. You're just this. You're just a B. You're not a human. And it kind of writes you off. If you don't know what that word is, ask your small group leader. They'd love to tell you about that. And we listen to a lot of music. A lot of times, some of y'all, we listen to music that have these words, and they kind of just write a person off and says that you're not really a human. You're not really equal to me. You're just this. And I think that's a big problem. I think it's a big problem because people are made in God's image. And I don't think we can just put them in a box and just write off a person that Jesus died for. Labels devalue humans because humans are made in God's image. That's all I want you to walk out. That's all I want you to think about. You might have some hard conversations in your small group. And for you, there might be a couple things you need to do about this. 2 things, and then I'm going to wrap up. Number 1 is that if you're putting labels on people, you need to stop. You need to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. You need to stop putting people in a box. Stop writing people off and saying, you're just this person, so I don't really want anything to do with you. You need to stop. But number 2, that's not enough to just not call someone a label like that. Because the biblical view of justice goes a step further. See, it's not enough to just not write someone off like that, but we also need to stand up for those who are being devalued. So we say, okay, I'm standing up here. I'm going to give up a little bit of my advantage. I'm going to give up a little bit of my advantage to help someone who's a little bit more disadvantaged, to go back to the way it was in the beginning, back to the garden. This is always what God wanted. And I believe, church, this is our responsibility, is to seek justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. If we do that, things are going to be just right. Let me pray for that. Lord Jesus, I thank you for this time, God. I thank you for this room of people who, I don't know what brought everyone into this room here tonight, God, but I know that you can work in this room, Lord, that you can work to bring justice into our world. Sometimes we look around and we see so much injustice that it can be It can be kind of hard to know what to do, God, but I think it can just start with us. It can start with us treating people the way you treated people when you died on the cross. It can start us treating people like they are in your image, God. I ask you to give us the strength to do that. Help us to have some great small group conversations about this, Lord. In your name we pray. Amen.